In this video, we're going to talk about using submixes. This approach can help you create space and separation in your mixes. It can help you manage dynamics, and I think it's just a really interesting and musical way to organize the elements in your mix. Let's do it. What's up? This is Jake with Musician on a Mission. So I picked up this idea from Grammy-winning mixer Michael Brower, who's kind of known for his signature multi-bus compression technique. And that involves blending different send levels to different auxes with different compressors on them. It's all very advanced and interesting. But instead of replicating his exact setup, I just kind of want to extract a major idea from his workflow, which is just strategically gluing larger groups of instruments or mix elements together. And really, we're just talking about sending all of our tracks to a level of group buses that get hit with some subtle processing before they reach the mix bus. So I know that might sound a little confusing at this point, but I promise this is going to make more sense as we move through the video. And honestly, I just think this is kind of a cool way to think about mixing. So let's dig into the session here and we'll talk about all the benefits along the way. So just to give you a little bit of context, this is the song that we're going to be working with. I'll play through the chorus. Cool. So here's how the session is laid out. I've got all my drums here and a few drum auxes, bass, and then guitars, and then all what I call the music. So this would be things like percussion elements, keyboards, synths, orchestral elements, samples, things like that. Then I've got a whole bunch of lead vocal tracks and auxes here. And I've got my background vocal tracks and auxes right here. And all of those get sent to the mix bus. Now, traditionally, we would use compression directly on the mix bus. So here, I've got the FG gray for a little bit of dynamic control, a little bit of glue. So that's cool, but we're going to blow that away. And we're going to approach this mix a little bit differently. We're going to strategically glue sections of instruments together. So the first thing I'm going to do here is create some auxes. I'm going to do, let's start off with 5. And then I'm going to scooch these to the left of my mix bus here. And for now, we're just going to name these A, B, C, D, E. I'm going to color code them. And then I'm going to make my mix bus slightly darker, a slightly darker shade. That would be fine. Then we're going to get all of these routed correctly. And we're going to set the inputs to an open bus. So I'm going a little bus crazy here. We're going to do 40, 41, 42, 43, and 44. So this is just the basic organizational structure. We've got our mix bus at the very top level here, and then we've got this intermediate level between the mix bus and all of our individual tracks and group buses. This I would refer to as either a summing level or the stem level, and these are basically just going to be buckets for mix elements to sit in. So let me show you what I'm talking about. We're going to go over here and we're going to route our drums to our first one, bus A. And I'm going to put those together with the bass. So I've got drums and bass being sent to bus A. So I'm actually going to call this drum and bass. So I would consider these like my low end instruments if you want to chop up different sections of the frequency spectrum. So I'd send my lows to this first one here. Let's see what else we got. For guitars, I would just send all of the guitars to a mid-range. So let's send those to our B bus. And then we're going to call this guitars. And then this C bus I would categorize as like a high frequency area. So for higher frequency stuff, I'm just gonna go ahead and take all of my music section and I'm gonna send that to my C bus. And I'm also gonna put my, do I want to put my background vocal? I'm gonna group my background vocals in there as well. Why not? Okay, and then for D, I'm gonna do lead vocals, sending those to there. And then for E, I'm just gonna go through and route all of my wet effects, all of my ambient effects to that E bus here. So I'll just quickly do that. And then I'm going to name this wet effects. So now in this stem level, I've broken down the mix organizationally into 5 different buckets. We've got our drum and bass bucket, our guitar bucket, our music and background vocal bucket, our lead vocal bucket, and our wet effects. So now that we've got everything directed into one of these 5 buckets, we can do some subtle processing to each one. So it's going to kind of simultaneously create some cohesion and space and separation. Because we've got drum and bass being sent to the same bus, well, let's play with that a little bit. So the reason I put drums and bass together is because these are kind of the foundation elements, right? They're lower in the frequency spectrum, with the exception of the cymbals, but they're lower in the frequency spectrum mostly, and they're going to be working together to create the foundation of the song. So I'm going to get those locked in and glued together and working together as a team. And for that, I'm going to toss on just an 1176. Now the key here is subtlety. You don't want to absolutely just like crush these giant groups of instruments and these giant groups of mix elements. It's just going to sound like a squishy, squashy mess. Instead, it's the accumulation of little adjustments and subtle tweaks that make this approach and this kind of technique so effective. So I'm just looking for a teeny tiny little bit of glue here. I'm talking between 1 and 3 decibels of gain reduction. Cool. And I'm going with a slow attack and a fast release for now, just to kind of move through the process. Next, I'm going to choose something different. The idea here is to make these just slightly, these groups of instruments, slightly different from one another. So if we're talking guitars, we're going to use the different types of coloration and character that each compressor has on the signal, and that creates even more space and separation between these buckets of instruments here. And it also creates a sense of depth, because each bucket of instruments are going to be reacting to their own compressors independently of one another. So normally everything would be reacting to a single compressor on the mix bus, but with this technique, you have the opportunity for each one of these buckets to react independently of all the others. And that can help the mix as a whole just kind of breathe and kind of pump in a really cool, open, dynamic kind of way. So let's just quickly continue setting this up here. I'm just gonna dial in guitars. So my guitars aren't quite hitting my minus 18 decibel sweet spot. You want to make sure that you're still gain staging here. So I'm going to go ahead and add some gain to the front end of that. Cool. So that's about what? 9. And I'll take it back down on the back end, just so I get my sweet spot signal hitting my compressor. Okay, I'm sticking with between 1 and 2 decibels of gain reduction there. And I'm actually going to activate this distortion 2 button, which is going to add just a little bit of warmth. Barely audible, but it's there. It just kind of makes it a little bit milky. So now we've got like a decibel of compression going on with our drum and bass. We've got like a decibel of compression here on our guitars. Let's move on to music and background vocals. So these are more higher end kind of elements here. I don't know. I'm going to do something. I'm going to do a little experimentation. So I'll go here, G moo. I want this more tubey kind of character. So here's a good example of how the character of a compressor or the coloration of a compressor can change the sound. I mean, we're not experiencing any gain reduction here. Just by activating this particular compressor, we're changing the coloration of the sound. Listen to this. So it's bringing up the top end. It's giving us like kind of like this sparkle and this openness on the top, which I think is actually suitable for this bucket of instruments since they're already kind of sitting up top there. So let's get this dialed in here. Just like a decibel or 2 of gain reduction. So I'm okay with that. I've just got a medium attack and a medium release. Not really gonna mess with this too much right now. I just kind of want to show you the basic concept here. The point is we're using this subtle compression to control a little bit of dynamic range, but more so impart its character on this group of instruments. For lead vocals, let's go ahead and pop something open here. Let's use something different. Let's do this modern. So this is similar to the 1176 we have on drums, but it's got just kind of like a brighter sound to it. I'm on fire, and jealousy don't look so good on you. I'm inspired, and just a little crazy, but maybe crazy is all it takes. I'm on fire. And jealousy don't look so good on you. That's fine right there. I should probably go back and gain stage that up a little bit so it's hitting the sweet spot, but that's okay for now. And I'm actually going to keep my wet effects open. I'm not going to put any kind of compression on there. I just kind of want them to be what they are. So I hope you're starting to see kind of the power of this approach now. I mean, we've got these drums and bass. They're working together under the same compression, and it's got a certain sound to it. The guitars are all working together under the same compression. They're being glued together by that compression, but the compression's also offering a tonal change or separation from what we've got going on in the drums and bass. We've got the music and background vocals. Again, same idea, different compressor, gluing this section together and imparting its tone on the signal. We've got the lead vocal here, different character, and this is just one one way to create separation between these tracks. I mean, the sky's the limit here, right? So let's say drum and bass. I mean, you've got some kind of wolfiness going on in the drum and bass. You can drag some EQ in here and bring it down a little bit. Okay, and then let the guitars have this space in the 600 area. So I'll show you this on a more visual type of EQ. So let's say you're having some trouble with the drum and the bass and the guitars, maybe, smashing into each other, having some frequency competition in there. Maybe there's some wolfiness or whatever. You can take a tiny little bit out of, let's say 600 is the problem area. Or maybe you just dip a wide area at 600 here and you go over to guitars and you say, okay, well, let's bring up guitars here in this spot. So now you created only a tiny decibel, right? 1 decibel of separation with EQ in these two areas, but they're groups of instruments. So it has a much broader effect. And that's kind of the takeaway here. That's kind of what I want you to be thinking about if you decide to try this technique. And it is very much a balancing act here. I know I've said it a bunch of times, but really subtlety is key. If you use an EQ and just chunk out giant frequencies in a bucket of a ton of mix elements like that, it's going to sound so unnatural and so weird. I mean, don't take my word for it. Try it for yourself. But small changes here can have a huge effect. So compression is one way that you can create separation between these buckets here. EQ is a way you can create separation between these elements. You can also do things like, oh man, the options are limitless here. You can add saturation. Let's say you want just a tiny little bit of saturation on the drums and bass. Yeah, I say tiny saturation and then crank it up to 10. I'd have to put my headphones on to hear that. But you get the idea. So maybe guitars, maybe you want to toss a little bit of flavor on the guitars. I'll push it through, add an EQ with some color to it. Maybe for your wet effects, you want to widen things up here. So we're going to go to stereo widener, or the ozone imager here. And I don't have any wet effects dialed in right now. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's say, I don't know. Let's bring a little bit of, let's just quickly dial something in here. Let's bring in some room reverb on our harmonies. Or our lead vocals and yells. I'm on fire, and jealousy don't look so good on you. I'm inspired, and just a little crazy, but maybe crazy is all it takes. I'm on fire, and jealousy don't look so good on you. I'm inspired, and just a little crazy, but maybe crazy is all it takes. And let's say I want a little bit of room reverb on something else. Let's put some room reverb on the piano here. Just to give it a little bit of distance. And I've got this mellotron happening here. I'm just going to crank that. So that sounds like super far away. So now I've got some wet effects coming into our wet effects bucket. Let's widen those up. Okay, we've got those wider, and maybe I want them a little bit further back in the mix. So let's filter them. Right? Because when things have less high end, they sound like they're further away. So that's another way that we're creating space and separation. We're separating all of our reverbs and all of our wet effects from everything else by making them wider, and we're also making them sound like they're further away with an EQ change here. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that if you don't have these plugins, you can just use this technique, just use the same concept with the plugins that you do have. Even if you're just working inside of Logic or whatever your DAW may be, if you're working with stock plugins, just use the stock plugins. I mean, you don't have to use the exact compressors I've got here. So let's say you want to use compression, use any one of Logic's compressors, right? Look at all these options here. I mean, you got 7 options right here if you're working inside of Logic. But what if you don't have a ton of different compressor types? Well, that's okay. Experiment with different types of distortions or saturations. Every DAW has a whole slew of plugins that you can use to introduce harmonic saturation or subtly change the tone in some way. The idea is to create cohesiveness on this stem level where you're bringing large groups of elements together per track, and then you're also creating space and separation between those buckets of tracks, creating more depth, creating some character, and just an overall more sonically interesting experience for your audience. Now, I'm not saying that this is the best way to mix. There are many ways to mix. This is but one way to mix that I think is super interesting and super musical. But all of that said, this is just one part of the process. You can do this right and still end up with mixes that don't sound great if you make mistakes in other areas. So that's why my friend Rob, the founder of Musician on a Mission, put together a free workshop where he shares his 7 steps to making radio-ready music at home. And what you're going to see in this workshop is a completely new approach to home recording and mixing that's going to help you get pro level results much, much faster. And it hasn't just worked for him. Over 36,000 people have already been through this workshop and seen results in a matter of days. So if you want to avoid wasting time, money, and effort on the wrong things and learn the exact 7 steps that are going to take your mixes to a professional standard in under a year, then make sure to go check out that workshop. It's completely free. You can either click the link on the screen or head to the link in the description to get access. As always, thanks for subscribing and supporting the channel. This is Jake signing off. Remember, create regardless.